The word analysis means to break something down in order to understand it. If I were talking to a chemist, if I used the word analysis, the chemist would know that this means to take a compound and break it down to see what went into it. When we're dealing with ratio analysis, we're doing the same sort of thing financially speaking. We're going to be using it to figure out what's inside of a number, but we're not doing it just for the sake of making computations. We're going to use ratio analysis to answer a specific question or set of questions. The purpose that I'm really trying to come around to is some sort of meaningful ratio analysis. I think that this is a shortcoming of most finance textbooks. They tend to teach that the proper way to do ratio analysis is to take a sheet of paper and compute about 50 million different computations and then look at those numbers and meditate on them until some sort of insight occurs to you. I think that's a waste of time and effort. I think it confuses students. And in my opinion, a much better way to approach it is to start with the question that you want to know the answer to and then figure out how are you going to determine that answer objectively. For instance, if you're examining the financial statements for a company, you might want to start with this very basic question. Is this a good use of investors' money? There is a financial ratio that you can use to answer that. Return on equity would be the answer. If you were going to compute return on equity, we're looking at the same sort of a formula that we talked about earlier in the course when we were talking about general return. We're going to be looking at the reward that is given divided by the cost that we paid to get that reward. So in the case of return on equity, we can probably figure out that formula simply by intuiting what would the return, or rather what would the reward be from the company versus what did an equity investor put into the company. So our return on equity is going to become the reward, or our profit, our net income that the company is generating, divided by the cost that the equity investor put in. So the total equity is going to be the denominator in our return on equity formula. Return on equity is simply net income divided by equity. And it answers the question, is this a good use of investors' money? If we wanted to analyze further, if we wanted to break this down further, there are three basic questions that we should answer. Number one, how profitable is the business? Number two, how efficiently are assets being used? And number three, how much does financial leverage help the investors? And there are legitimate financial ratios that will answer each of those questions. In the case of profitability, I would use the profit margin, which I'll abbreviate with the letters PM. If I were talking about the efficiency around assets, I would look at the total asset turnover, or TAT. Total asset turnover is going to be my first step at looking at the efficiency of a company. And if I'm wondering about the financial leverage, I'm going to look at what's called the equity multiplier, the EM. Now in the textbook, he uses some slightly different abbreviations than I do occasionally. In this case, the equity multiplier is going to be the same thing that the author talks about being the FLM, the financial leverage multiplier. Finance textbooks are about evenly divided on which one they use. I prefer equity multiplier because it's a little bit easier to work with, and it relates directly to some work that I refer to around the sustainable growth rate. So I'm going to stick with the abbreviations as I'm showing them in the slides. But you should make a note in your textbook that it's the same formula that we're going to be working with, only a different label that the author puts on it. These three things are really the drivers of return on equity. Profitability, or our profit margin, is going to be simply the net income divided by sales, and it answers the question, how profitable is this business? The total asset turnover is simply going to be the sales relative to the total assets invested in the company. In other words, for every dollar in assets, how many dollars in sales do we get each year? And it answers the question, how efficiently are assets being used? The equity multiplier is going to be the total assets divided by the total equity in the company. Now, total assets represents the total investment in the firm, and all of those assets had to come from one of two places. They had to either come from debt or equity. So what we're really looking at is the ratio of the total assets, including debt-backed assets, divided by just the equity portion of this. In other words, how much of an increase in assets did we get as a result of borrowing money? This increase in assets is called leverage. And so the equity multiplier answers the question, how much does financial leverage help the investor? And the way that this relates to our return on equity is simply this. Return on equity is the product of those three factors. It's our profit margin times our total asset turnover times our equity multiplier. In the case of the return on equity, we're looking at the net income divided by equity. The profit margin the total asset turnover, and the equity multiplier combine to produce net income divided by equity, which means that we've got a little bit of rearrangement that we can do. If we look at the formula for each of those, net income divided by sales, sales divided by total assets, and total assets divided by equity, we can do a little bit of canceling. Canceling is the one thing that I think everybody remembers from learning how to do fractions. It was the most fun because you got to strike through the things on the bottom and then on the top. When you're multiplying fractions, if you see the same thing on the bottom and the top, you can cancel them out. So in the case of this particular relationship, we're going to be able to cancel out sales on the top and bottom. We'll be able to cancel out total assets on the top and bottom, and we're left with just net income over equity. This relationship is called the DuPont identity, and using the DuPont identity to dig into a set of numbers is called DuPont analysis. This is the very last thing that's presented usually in any textbook's discussion of ratio analysis. They add it as sort of an afterword. I prefer to use it as the fundamental basis for ratio analysis. It introduces three very basic questions which lead up to an overall question that everybody should want to know. Is this business a good use of investors' money? And if so, how or how is it not? Is it very profitable? Is it not very profitable? Is it very efficient or not very efficient? Is it using adequate leverage or not enough leverage? If we wanted to dig into those questions, the idea of a couple of notes about the way that ROE and the DuPont identity are handled in the textbook. First of all, the author uses earnings available to common shareholders for his ROE computations. And while this isn't terribly incorrect, it's not technically correct either. ROE, return on equity, is defined as the net income divided by the total equity in the firm. What the author is doing is taking the earnings available to common shareholders, so he's taken net income and he's removed the preferred dividends from it. And he's going to divide that by the equity except for the preferred equity. So he's taking total equity and subtracting the preferred equity from it. That is going to give us something called return on common equity. ROCE is how this is abbreviated in most finance textbooks. And it answers a slightly different question than return on equity does. ROCE answers the question, is this a good use of the common shareholders' money? If we're wondering how hard all of the investors' money is working, we want to compute the return on equity. If we're just interested in the common shareholders' money, we want to compute the return on common equity. And we're never able to mix and match. ROCE uses earnings available to common shareholders and common equity. ROE uses net income and total equity. Now, the return on assets is a similar number. Return on assets is the net income divided by the total assets in the firm. And the way that our author defines this is the earnings available to common shareholders divided by total assets. He's engaging in the sin of mixing and matching. He's got total assets, including those that are backed by preferred equity, involved in the denominator, but not in the numerator. ROE and ROA are sometimes very, very heavily manipulated numbers. They're not included in GAAP, so they're not managed by any sort of accounting oversight. They're simply numbers that are helpful to investors to interpret how well a company is doing. And if an investor is going to use this to form an opinion of management, that means that management is going to want to cast those numbers in a way that's going to make them look as good as possible. As an analyst, you should always compute your own figures for analysis. This is easy and simple to do, working with figures from, say, Yahoo Finance. In the event that you're looking at a set of numbers, the possibility of them being manipulated is pretty large, but the extent to which they're being manipulated is usually very, very small. And there have been some notable exceptions. Yahoo, for instance, eliminated from the total assets that would go into their ROA number any inclusion of their foreign investments. So they excluded Alibaba and they excluded all of their other foreign investments from their operating assets. And they're presenting that as the total return on assets of the company. This is something that the CEO was engaged in order to make her look better to the investors. Ultimately, the company had huge problems because of their position with Alibaba, because of their exposure to risk and uncertainty. And the CEO wound up being fired, not for manipulating numbers, but for not making decisions that were creating good value in Yahoo. As an analyst, it was easy to catch if you did your own numbers. If you didn't, it was easy for the management to be able to hide behind these ratios that they were presenting for your digestion.